Let's go ahead and start. Hello, everyone. I'm Carl Silverstein with the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy. Welcome to our webinar all about bats, ecology and conservation. We're so glad you're able to join us today. And I am happy to be able to introduce Kyle Shute, who works with Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy. Kyle's a wildlife biologist, formerly worked with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission and joined our staff this year. At SAHC, we have three main strategic goals: protecting important places in the mountains in Western North Carolina and East Tennessee. And that includes places for people to get outdoors for recreation, wildlife corridors, watersheds, and productive farms. And we really focus on helping build climate resilience in the landscape and emphasize places for people in the landscape. And in addition to the protecting land, we also have a long-term stewardship mission, stewarding the conservation interests we hold on about 80,000 acres. And then we also emphasize the globally significant highlands of Rhone and stewarding and restoring habitat there. A third goal of ours is organizationally is connecting people with land. And we do that in a number of ways through offering guided outdoor hikes to we have a community farm where we have agricultural programming with an incubator program for beginning farmers and other kinds of ways of trying to get people active in the outdoors. So we're thrilled to be able to share our Lunch and Learn series, and especially happy today to be able to introduce Kyle with All About Bats. If you have questions along the way, please type those into the chat or the Q&A. We're happy to answer questions as we go, and then there should be time at the end of the presentation for questions as well. So Kyle, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Carl. And thanks everyone for being here today. I'm really excited to share some information about bats, and especially for those folks who found us on batweek.org. I'm really excited to have a large audience today from not just our area in North Carolina, but from the broader area as well. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about, there we go. Today I'm going to structure this talk by talking about a couple of different topics. I'm going to start by discussing worldwide bat populations and species. I'm going to talk specifically about the bats of Western North Carolina and their ecology. I'm going to talk about conservation threats to those bats, particularly the ones that we have here in North Carolina. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can do as researchers, as members of the community, as everyone to help protect bat populations. But first, a little bit of background about myself. I, as Carl mentioned, am a bat biologist, and before I started at SAHC, I worked probably the previous 6 or so years as one. It started with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, and then continued with my master's work at Clemson University in South Carolina, where I researched specifically bat habitat of conservation concerned species on private lands in the coastal Southeast. And then more recently with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. And so getting into our talk today, worldwide, bats have a really incredible diversity. There are 1,456 different species of bats, and that's across every single continent except for Antarctica. And of these species, there is this really great diversity of what they look like, and they're actually the second most diverse group of mammals, right behind rodents. And so I like to show this slide because I think all of these bats display very effectively the diversity, not only of what these species look like, but the roles that they play ecologically in their different systems across the world. And so starting by looking at this bat in the lower left-hand corner, it's a nectivorous bat, which means it's drinking nectar from that flower to eat. And the really important role that they play is by pollinating, much in the way that we think of insects pollinating in our area of North America. This bat's going to go to this flower and feed on the nectar, and then go to a different flower to feed on more nectar, and in turn, it's pollinating those plants. There are species like this one that are insectivorous, which means it's an insect-eating bat. All of the bats we have in North Carolina are insectivorous, and they play really important roles in suppressing insect populations, particularly those that are human pests, either directly to humans or agricultural pests that eat crops. There are species like this one that are frugivorous or fruit-eating bats, and they play very important roles by consuming fruit and in turn seeds, and then spreading those seeds across the landscape. And then there are species like this one where it's a little bit hard to see what it's eating, but in its lower right-hand foot, you can see that it's a fish, so it's a piscivorous bat or fish-eating bat. But here in the mountains of North Carolina, we have 14 of these 1,400 more than 1,400 global bat species. And even just in our small area, we can see a pretty large diversity in what these bats look like. They have different fur colors. There are some that are brown, some that are tan or sort of yellow, some that have silver hair, some that are red, others that have huge ears, some that have smaller ones. And of these 14 species, there are 6 of them that are currently listed under the Endangered Species Act or under review for listing by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And of those other species, 2 that are here but not federally protected, we have species of special concern that are state listed to some degree. And not only do these bats have very diverse ways that they look, but they also have very diverse ecologies. And what I mean when I talk about the ecology of a species is the way that that species interacts with both its living and non-living environment around us, and how it impacts the behavior of the species, what it eats, where it lives, how it survives throughout the year. And so I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about what that looks like for the species that we have here in the mountains. So I'll start by talking about what and how bats eat. And as I mentioned before, all the bats that we have here in Western North Carolina are insectivorous. So they're eating those insects, and quite a diversity of insects between moths and flies and aquatic insects and beetles. Depending on the species, they can all eat very different insects. And they eat these insects and find them by the use of echolocation. Now, echolocation is a process when an animal, or in this case, a bat, emits a very high frequency call. That call goes out into space. It bounces off things and comes back to the bat. And that in turn, the time between when the bat made the call and when it hears it again can tell how far or in relation to space this bat is. So it could be bouncing off things like cave walls or trees or insects. And that's how that bat is moving around at night and how it's able to forage. It's sort of one of the common misconceptions about bats is that they're blind. That's actually not really the case. They have very similar eyesight to people. But if we think about how easy it is for people to walk around at night without any sort of light, it's really difficult. And so it'd be very difficult for a bat as well. And so if we think about how people have evolved to be able to develop technology that allows us to move around at night and see at night, bats have evolved a different tactic of echolocation that allows them to move and survive throughout the night. And part of this echolocation call that's very interesting is that, of course, these calls are at such a high frequency that people aren't able to hear them, but bats are. So one of the ways that we collect information on these calls is by using something like what's on the screen now called a spectrogram. Now, a spectrogram is basically the visual representation of those high frequency calls. So we can record the calls with a very highly sensitive microphone, and then basically plot out what those calls look like. And not only does the way that bats forage on insects or move about their landscape vary based on the insect species that they're targeting, but it can also vary based on what the habitat is like. And so depending on which species is which and their characteristics like their size and how fast they fly, they can forage in different types of habitat. And so there are some species that will choose to forage within more forested or intact forest areas. They're usually a little bit smaller and can easily maneuver around branches and trees that are in these areas. There are some species that will move along the edge between, say, this pond and the edge of an intact forest and pick insects off of the trees there or out of the air. And then there are some species that are very large and they fly very quickly, and they use more typically open areas because it's easier for them to maneuver in. So depending on which species is which, they'll use very different types of habitat when they're foraging. And so as I start to get into the habitat that bat species use, I talked a little bit about foraging, but one of the other things that's interesting about bats and how we have a very incredible diversity of these species in our area of the US is where they live and how that varies by species. So I'm going to start by talking about where these bats live in the winter and why the different tactics that bats use to survive during cooler times of year. And so there are some species like the tricolored bat and the gray bat here on the left that will use caves and mines to hibernate during the winter. And I'll go into a little bit more depth about what hibernation means. And then there are species like this red bat that's here tucked away in the foliage that's on the ground that will migrate long distances to warmer areas during the summer and then south during the winter to warmer areas when it starts to get cooler at those more northern latitudes. And additionally, they'll bury themselves in leaves to protect themselves from predators and also to insulate themselves a little bit better from the conditions. So when I talk about hibernation, this describes a period of lowered energy expenditure in periods of something that we call torpor. Now, torpor is a physiological state, so it's a body state in which a bat lowers its body temperature and its heart rate, and that allows it to survive for longer periods of time while using less energy. And so this is really useful in getting through periods of time where there's less food or water resources for an animal. If we think about winter conditions, either in high latitudes in North America or even in the mountains of the Southeast, we can go through periods of pretty cool temperatures that aren't very easy for a bat to survive, but there's also very few insects for them to feed off of. And so what hibernation does is it relies on fat stores that those bats have accrued during summer and fall before this hibernation period, where they can just eat and eat and eat so that they can have large fat stores and then slowly use those to fuel their body during these periods of time where they're using a lot of less energy. And then there are those other species that use migration, like this hoary bat here, that will move from up into northern parts of Canada all the way down into the southern part of the US. And in making these long distance trips, they have to do that because living at those more northern latitudes, there are fewer prey species. The winters are very severe. And so instead of sticking around in those areas and hibernating like some species have done, they've evolved to move great distances to areas in the south that might be a little bit warmer during the winter. You might have cool periods, but those will be typically followed by periods of warmer time where there may be a little bit of insect activity that they can feed off of. And so that's how they've been able to adapt to survive these variable conditions throughout North America. And so I've talked a little bit about what bats are doing in the winter, but I'm going to transition now to talking a little bit about the types of habitat that they use during the summer. And while there are some species that will continue to use caves or rocky outcrops during the summer as well, like the gray bat that will use caves and mines year round, they also, along with other species, will use some human structures like bridges and culverts, which in some ways are sort of similar to caves or rocky areas. There are also bat species that will use bat boxes, which is a way that people have been able to add roosting habitat to the landscape. And then there are species that will use trees and snags, both live trees and dead snags, to roost in, either in cavities under bark that's shelving off of the tree, in broken limbs, or in the case of this red bat, in the foliage, the live foliage in the tree. They'll group themselves around leaves in that foliage that's there during the summer. And so now that I've been able to give a little bit of context to the conservation of, to some of the ecology of some of these species, I want to talk a little bit about the conservation threats that they face, particularly with focus on our area of the Southeast, but throughout North America more broadly as well. Now, this figure on the left shows different proportions of species that are threatened by different conservation threats. And so I'm going to go through a few of them that some of the species here face. One of them is logging and harvesting of plants, which is, in our case, mostly large-scale removals of forests that some of these bats rely on. Human intrusions and disturbance. This is a really important one. When people intrude into Hibernacula or important roost areas where there are a lot of bats around, can cause disturbance to some of these species. Urban development, as we know in our area of Western North Carolina, as well as throughout a lot of the Southeast and US more broadly, we're going through a period of a lot of human expansion onto the landscape. And so development of human infrastructure can remove some of the habitat for these species. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. And then finally, energy production and mining, both in terms of wind energy production, which I'll also discuss a little bit in more depth, as well as mining and removal and disturbance to crust layers of the earth that can have old mines and inoperable mines and caves in them. But the one thing that this figure doesn't really get at, because it is looking at that whole worldwide scale, is disease. And very specifically in North America, the disease white nose syndrome has caused one of the biggest conservation threats to a whole number of species of bats here. White nose syndrome is a fungal pathogen, and it basically infects the skin tissue of bats. And so you can see this tricolored bat here on the right has a little bit of this white color around its nose. That's the symptoms of the fungus. And this fungus has been able to spread very effectively across North America, first being discovered in central New York in 2007, and it's pretty much now throughout most of the US and Canada. And the issue with this disease is that it happens to grow very effectively in these cave and mine habitats that these bats are using in the winter. So it grows very well in cool conditions and very humid conditions, which just so happen to be the exact conditions that bats seek out during these hibernation periods. And the issue with this disease is that it causes the bats to wake up during the winter. It irritates them. There's likely some sort of impact to their ability to hibernate and go into torpor. And that causes them to eat through these fat reserves. And so bats will use up all of their stored energy and then not be able to forage or find insects to feed on in the middle of the winter. And so this has caused really steep declines in a number of these cave hibernating bats of up to 99% in some places. And that's the reason that some of these species are threatened so much. Now, one of the other conservation threats that I mentioned was wind energy development. And this is, instead of impacting those cave species, it's impacting more of these migratory species that are moving long distances throughout the year. And so likely these mortalities are either being caused by direct strikes to spinning air turbines or wind turbines, or by air pocket pressures that are caused by those blades spinning. And it's estimated that greater than 500,000 bats are killed each year by these wind turbines. Now, one of the positive things about this is that there's research indicating recently that it's actually pretty easy to mitigate some of the mortalities from these by slowing wind turbines during those peak migratory times, reduces bat mortality by quite a bit, and doesn't compromise that much energy development as well. Another conservation threat that I mentioned was human intrusion and disturbance or destruction to Hibernacula. This is a cave in Missouri that has had issues with dumping in it for a very long time. And human disturbance to these areas, either people going in and disturbing bats in the winter, can also wake them up during this really sensitive time for them, and can be very dangerous to bats as they are trying to be at that lowered body condition and energy expenditure time of year. But probably the main thing that I'm going to focus on for the purposes of our talk today is forest loss. And I'll talk specifically about forest loss in the Southeast. The Southeast is projected to be a hotspot of forest loss and urban development in North America. And as you can see by looking in these little red boxes around our area of Western North Carolina, you can see that there's pretty high probability of human expansion on the landscape along the I-40 and I-26 corridors right around Asheville and throughout Western North Carolina. And so with this, and the natural land loss that's projected to happen in this region as well, we get two major issues, and those are habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. And so to give you a little bit of an idea about what habitat loss looks like, let's imagine that we have a fully intact large area of habitat that these bats are using and have access to. They can get to their winter hibernacula in this cave. They can get to their summer foraging and roosting areas over here. And then we have a situation in which there's some development. And that happens on, let's say, about half of that contiguous habitat area. And now these bats have a more restricted habitat area that they need to still carry out all of their daily activities in. So they still have access to their winter hibernacula and a little bit of their forest that they would use during the summer, but now it's a much more constricted area, and there are more bats in an area with less resources. And so this may increase bats having to compete with each other for some of these resources, and it may not be able to support as many bats as the whole area could have. And so then the next part I want to talk about is habitat fragmentation. And so let's imagine again that there's this larger area of habitat that the bats can access all of their yearly needs in. But then we have a highway that's put in through the middle of it. So now we have sort of two separated patches of habitat that these bats might not be able to as easily move between. When people think about bats, they typically think, oh, well, they can fly, so they should be able to get over this pretty easily. But if you think about how a highway or other infrastructure fragments habitat, this highway is associated with really loud noises, fast-moving vehicles, lights, and there's some indication that bats can be deterred away from crossing these areas, or these areas can lead to direct mortality of these bats if they're moving and are struck by a vehicle. So the bats on the right side are now able to still access their winter hibernacula and a little bit of their foraging habitat. But these ones on the left may be intimidated away or not able to get back to their hibernacula habitat on the right side of the highway. And so if we think about this in a little bit more of a real world context, we'll start out with talking about habitat loss. And so this is the sort of western side of Asheville here in Western North Carolina, right around the I-26 and I-40 interchange. If we look at this area sort of around the Brevard Road, Asheville Outlet Malls area, this is something that used to be naturally occurring forest. And now it's been lost and developed to a point where there's not really any habitat left there. And so this is what we're talking about when we mean habitat loss. And then habitat fragmentation is occurring in these two patches of intact or mostly intact habitat. We have the Scotts Ridge area that was recently protected down here to the southern side of the map. And those are areas that still have contiguous habitat there, but they've been fragmented from each other by infrastructure around I-40 here and some of the development that's associated with it. And so if a bat were to be moving between these, this one protected parcel and this other area of intact forest, it's going to be a lot more difficult than if it had all been intact forest. And so thinking about how we can maintain connectivity between these patches of habitat and then retain patches of habitat from full development is really important for some of these species. And so with that, I'm going to move a little bit into what we can do specifically to protect bats. And I'll start by talking a little bit about how scientists are researching and figuring out how to protect bats. One of the main ways that we monitor bats is by capturing them. And so we'll do this using mist nets, which is right here on the left picture above this pool. And they're typically placed above sources of water or along corridors in trails, on dirt roads in national forests, somewhere that bats are going to be either drawn to or flying along. And when this net is expanded all the way to the top of the poles, the bats will fly into the net and sort of drop safely into these little pockets. And at that point, a researcher could come out and take the bat out. And so some of the things we do when we're processing a bat after its capture is we identify the species, we take some measurements, we look at its body condition to make sure that it's healthy. We can put small metal bands on them that allow for us to identify the bat in the future. It'll have little numbers on it, much in the way that bird bands do. And so we can identify when that bat is captured or seen again later. And then we can also do things like tracking the bat long-term by putting a little radio transmitter on it. That's what this wire is coming to right here. And these radio transmitters allow us to track bats at night where they're flying around, or they allow us to track them to where they're roosting so we can identify those critical habitat features that need to be protected. And so these transmitters are just glued on to the back of the bat's fur, and they usually stay on for about 2 weeks or so before falling off. And once they fall off, they don't cause any harm to the bat. It's sort of, they just grow their hair out and the glue deteriorates and then it falls off. So it allows us to, for a short time, track where these bats are without causing any harm to them. Now, we also use Hibernacula surveys as a way to monitor populations of bats. And these are when researchers go into a Hibernacula, like a cave or a mine, year after year and count bats. And so we get an overall number of bats that are using that. We can sometimes identify if an individual has a band on. We can identify either where it was captured or where that band was put on, and then where it was seen during other times. And we can also, because bats are have such a high fidelity to these Hibernacula year after year, they're going back to them year after year, we can track the total number of bats that are using this cave or mine as a way to monitor population. Now, I'll also talk a little bit about how we can use acoustics to study bats. And so you'll recognize this spectrogram from earlier in my talk. And what we're doing here is there's a small recording device with a very high frequency microphone that is set out overnight, and we'll collect these calls, and then researchers can actually identify which bats are which species by these calls. So we can get a total number of counts of the number of calls that we recorded during a time and for which species they belong to. And so this is a way that is a little bit less invasive. We don't need to capture the bats or anything, but we can still get estimates of how many bats and what kinds of bats are in these areas. And this is one way that the public can help monitor bats and work towards their conservation by participating in monitoring via the North American Bat Monitoring Program. And this is a North American wide program that basically is a standardized way of surveying for these species. And what you do is you mount a small microphone to the top of your car and drive a predetermined road route. And that microphone will collect, it'll go to an iPad that's in the car, and it'll collect all of those calls. And those calls can then be taken and sent to researchers who can identify the calls. And all of those data from all across the US and Canada are put together in one spot so that we can look at overall trends in bat populations and where they are on the landscape. And so in North Carolina, this program is run by the Wildlife Resources Commission, and you can sign up to volunteer. We'll send out a link that has information about how you can get to that page to sign up and express interest in volunteering. And it's a pretty low commitment volunteering. You drive one transect 2 times during the summer. It's over the course of 2 weeks. And then send that data to a researcher, and then they'll do all the rest. So we'll send out that link afterwards that you can look at and sign up if you're interested. Another way that we can protect bats is by protecting their cave and mine environments. And we can do that by avoiding going into any of these spaces, especially during the winter when these bats are very sensitive. Managers, wildlife management agencies have, for some Hibernacula that are very important, started installing these bat gates, which are in the middle. And that allows bats to get in, but not people to disturb them during the winter. And so bats can get in and out when they need to, but people can't get in to disturb them. And then the final thing that we can do too is protecting bats in relationship to white nose syndrome. Now, white nose syndrome is thought to have come over to North America from Europe, likely on some contaminated caving gear of some kind, because there are similar funguses in Europe that bats have adapted to be able to survive. And so one of the ways that we can make sure that we're not further spreading the fungal spores that cause the fungus to grow elsewhere is by making sure that we clean any boots or clothing that we go into a cave with. So even in open show caves or tourist caves, like let's say Linville Caverns, they do a great job at educating people on how to make sure they're cleaning their boots. There's a little bucket of bleach and brushes that you can clean your boots off with, so you're not potentially bringing those spores elsewhere. And then we can also help provide remaining habitat for bats on any private land that folks have too. You can retain a diversity of trees, both live and dead, including those standing snags if it's safe for your property and people to do so, because it allows for more habitat for these bat species to be able to live in. Also, protecting access to clean water on your property is really important, and avoiding the use of stuff like pesticides that can either reduce insect populations or could potentially get on an insect and then be passed along to a bat when it's feeding on it as well. And finally, protecting any really critical habitat features like mines or caves that might have bats roosting in them during the winter is also really important. Making sure you avoid going into any of those places during that time of year, communicating that they exist on private lands to agencies that might want to survey for bats in them is also very important. And making sure those places are permanently protected as well. You can also install bat boxes on your property, which is a way that we can add to bat habitat for some species. We'll also send a link out to Bat Conservation International's website. They have great information on where you can get bat boxes, as well as the best conditions to mount them in, how you should set them up. And so we'll send out a link with that information as well. There also may be a situation in which you find that you have bats in your attic or in a human structure of some kind. And this isn't really safe for bats or for people. And that's because even though only about 1% of wild bat populations have rabies, it's still a very serious disease. And so you want to make sure that you're always avoiding contact with bats. If you find that you have had contact with a bat, that it's either bitten or scratched you, or if you wake up in a room that has a bat, it's important to seek medical advice on what you should do next and go see a doctor about that. But if you do find that you have bats in an attic or in your house, you can do something called an exclusion. And that's basically when a trained wildlife professional will come to your house, they'll seal up all of the entrances and exits to the area that the bats are getting in, and then make a one-way exit so that bats can fly out, but they can't fly back in again. And that will remove them from your area, and they'll move to another place that's more safe for them. There are some regulations about when you can do this based on which state you're in. And that's because you don't want to have a situation in which you've excluded bats where there could be young that are unable to fly still in that area and the mothers can't get back to them at that point. So generally, these exclusions have to be conducted after mid-August, and that's when all of the bats can fly. And finally, the way that I'll sort of wrap this up today in conjunction with the work that we do here at Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy is protecting and conserving the landscape more broadly. And we're doing this not only for bats, but for all wildlife species. And our goal is to have patches of protected land that have wildlife connectivity so bats can move between them, as well as other species can move in between these protected parcels. And so that's what we're working on, both with public agencies and private landowners, and particularly protecting any important habitat features that you have on your property. If you have caves and mines, protecting those features is really important for bats, especially if they are being used in the winter as important Hibernacula. And the last thing that I'll say too, and we'll send out a link for this as well, is this great documentary that just came out on Monday or Sunday, I believe. It follows bat researchers and conservation folks that work in Western North Carolina, and it gives a lot of great, more in-depth information about white nose syndrome. And so I really encourage people to check it out. It's very well done, and I'm really excited about it as well. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions that folks have.
Thank you so much, Kyle. That was a fantastic, rich presentation. And we do have one question, which is from Mary Louise Murphy, who lives in Biltmore Lake. And I don't know if you could read that there, or I could read it out loud for the group.
Yeah, so let's see. I live in Biltmore Lake in Western North Carolina. For about 10 years or so, I've had 2 bat houses on the backside of my house. I've counted 40 plus bats leaving nightly this summer. That is really exciting, Mary. What species typically live in bat houses? Should I do any winter maintenance on the houses? That's a great question, and really exciting that you had that many bats. That's a lot for bat houses, and sometimes it can take a long time for bats to move into those houses. It's likely that probably most of those bats are either big brown bats, which are probably our most common bat species, and then they could also be Mexican free-tailed bats. That species is expanding its range and is now more present in Western North Carolina than it typically has been. They could also be that. In a very sort of like the most rare species that they could be is the little brown bat, which we used to have for a long time, or in large populations throughout Western North Carolina and North America in general, but they've been hit really hard by white nose syndrome. So it's unlikely that there are many, but it's possible that there could be a couple of those as well. So those are probably the 3 most common species that it would be.
And the maintenance on the houses, maintenance on bat houses, if any.
Yeah, you don't really need to do a whole lot during the winter. Most of the time, the bats will leave and go to wherever they're roosting in the winter, or they'll go through seasonal movements. So you don't really have to do a whole lot unless you find that, you know, it's becoming unstable or parts of it are falling off or something. You would want to repair those. But that's really the only kind of maintenance you would need to do.
Super. Moving along through the questions, a couple of folks have asked if there'll be an archived copy of the webinar, and we will put this up on YouTube. So if you go to Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy's YouTube channel, this will be available there along with other Lunch and Learn webinars we've done too. So thanks for asking about that. Question about whether there's other diseases that bats might spread other than rabies.
Yeah, so in North America, that is typically the biggest concern. If you have gone into like a cave or a very humid, warm place, typically that's going to be like in the tropic region, not really so much in North America. It's possible that you get histoplasmosis, but that's why you want to avoid those areas where there's like a ton of bat droppings and guano. One of the other things that's probably important to address is the relationship, the lack of information about or data that support the hypothesis that COVID-19 could have come from bat populations. Recent research has actually indicated that it's unlikely that that the COVID-19 pandemic started from bats. It is possibly another mammal species, but you'll notice that in some of those pictures we were wearing masks, and that's because we did pause research on bats for about a year, you know, the summer when the COVID-19 pandemic was really at its start. And we didn't know if potentially we could pass the COVID-19 virus on to bats. And so that was one of the main concerns, is that bats have already experienced these diseases like white nose syndrome that have impacted them. But we haven't, we don't want to give another disease to bats that could impact their populations. So in the US, predominantly it's rabies. There are other potential ones that aren't very likely. And at this point, the research indicates that it's unlikely that the coronavirus came from bats. And it also seems unlikely that we can give it back to bats too. That's sort of what the most recent research is indicating.
Cool. Question about white nose syndrome and whether climate change might possibly slow its spread.
Yeah, so it was, you broke up for a second, but it was about white nose syndrome spread and the relationship between that and climate change.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. At this point, white nose syndrome is pretty much ubiquitous across most of North America, which is pretty sad. It's pretty devastating, but it's unlikely that it will reduce the prevalence of white nose syndrome, because we've seen across the entire breadth of really North America, its transmission and its growth and impact on species is very similar about like from the most northern parts of North America to the southern parts of North America. So it's unlikely that it will cause like a reduction in white nose syndrome of any kind. I think what's probably more likely is that remaining bat species will be able to develop resistance over time. They'll basically evolve to have some sort of resistance to the fungus. And we're sort of already seeing that with some of the bats that are still here, the ones that survive year after year, is they have some reason that they survive during that time. And so we are sort of, that's one potential option, is that we'll see a little bit of a recovery. And each year we kind of hope that we will see that recovery or start to see it because bats are better able to survive. The ones that are left are better able to survive. And then I see another question too about potential treatments for white nose syndrome too, which I think now is a good time to address. There are some researchers that are working on treatments for the fungus. That's of course like very intensive because you have to go in, and the main treatment right now is basically an aerosol spray. The chemical is derived of a compound of bananas that keeps bananas from growing fungus and desiccating and decaying as quickly. And it doesn't really have an impact on the bats besides the fungus that's growing on them. So that's one way that we're looking at treating white nose syndrome, because that could potentially be applied very broadly. But there's other research too that indicates that bats that are fatter when they go into hibernation are better able to survive white nose syndrome too. And so there's also research that's being conducted at some important hibernacula here in Western North Carolina as well, that they're trying to attract insects to the outsides of these caves during the fall time when bats are getting ready to go into hibernation, so they can eat a lot more and then better survive the winter.
Cool. So many good questions to choose from. One was whether there's other animals that we know of that are susceptible to white nose syndrome.
Yeah, that's a great question. There aren't any that we are aware of right now. It doesn't impact people in any way. It doesn't impact, to our knowledge, other species that live in caves and mines. You know, there are salamander species, there are spider species, flies, insects that live in caves, and it doesn't appear that it impacts any other species. But that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't.
Thanks, Kyle. We have a question of whether there's any strategies to help bats cope with a fragmented landscape.
Yeah, pretty much the biggest strategy for us is making sure that we can maintain some sort of connectivity between patches that remain. So one of the things that conservation groups, land trusts across North America, one of the things that we focus on in partnership with some of our other partners as well is making sure that we can connect that landscape. And that's probably the biggest strategy is folks thinking about how specifically to be able to connect those parcels that are protected.
Great. A couple of questions from Betty Boone, who lives at high elevation, just under 5,000 feet, having put up bat boxes and tried to follow directions and asking whether bats will use them eventually.
Yeah, it can take a pretty long time for bats to be able to, I guess, to be comfortable moving into those new areas. Because they have a pretty high fidelity in some cases to a certain area or trees or caves or mines, it can take a little while for them to move into bat boxes, but don't give up because they can eventually. And it's likely that I see another question too, because you live at sort of a higher elevation and seeing bats leaving the eaves of your home during the summer. It's likely that those bats do, to a degree, leave in the winter. Like they're probably not still under your eaves during the winter, especially because you are at a sort of higher elevation. Some of those species will probably move to caves and mines that are somewhere in the area. And then there are other ones that might move greater distances to a little bit more stable, lower elevations where the conditions may be more favorable in the winter.
Super. So still a couple of questions about being able to find the presentation on YouTube. And if you search Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy on YouTube, I think it will bring you to the channel, and the presentation should be live either later today or tomorrow there. A question about a bat that a cat caught and killed. So I guess there's a question about whether the species can be identified from a photo. I don't know if they want to send you that photo, Kyle.
Yeah, that's fine. And I'm happy to take a look at it. It sort of depends on the picture and it depends on the species. So there are some species that it's really obvious what they look like. You know, just kind of thinking about that first slide that I showed of all the bats that we have in Western North Carolina. There are some that are, you know, like as big as like a small bird, and then there are other ones that are like the weight of a couple paper clips. So depending on what species it is, it's potentially identifiable, but sometimes it can be hard to see those characteristics that you have to look at, and those aren't always very visible in pictures.
A couple of questions about recreating in caves, and is bleach the best thing to use? Does laundering hiking clothes help?
Yeah, so if you were to ever like recreate and go into a cave or mine, the best thing to do, and the way that researchers will do it, is usually, you know, like wear coveralls or something that can be sort of taken off. You can bag them up when you leave. And then you can take them. The ratio, I believe, that is Fish and Wildlife's recommendation for bleach to water is a ratio of 10-1. So you would have, for every 1 gallon of bleach, you would have 10 gallons of water. And the soaking time is, I think, 10 minutes. But there's a website that we can also send out the information for called whitenose.org. And I think they have the most up-to-date information on how to decontaminate stuff. Soaking in that bleach solution for 10 minutes, though, should kill any of the fungus. And then you can just like wash the stuff normally and it's fine.
Super, thanks. You talked about rabies before, but an additional question is how long can they survive? How long can they carry the rabies before they die? And how do bats contract rabies to begin with?
Sure. So typically bats will contract rabies from other bats. And they, in terms of the length that they would carry it, I don't know the exact amount of time between infection and if they were to die of it. But, you know, once a bat gets to a point where it's not flying around on its own, it's like seeming confused, it's like on the ground, unable to get itself to a tree to climb back up. Usually that's the point when it's getting pretty close to death. I will say that not all times when you see a bat that's out, say it's out during the day, or like one roosting on a tree pretty low down, or even on the ground, doesn't necessarily mean it has those, sorry, my dog's whining. Doesn't mean it necessarily has rabies. Bats can also just get confused and like fall to the ground or like fall out of a roost. And most of the time they can climb back up onto a tree. If you put them sort of towards the base, or if they are towards the base, they can climb up that tree and still be able to get back to their habitat. So just because you see like a bat flying around during the day or on the ground doesn't necessarily mean it has rabies. It could indicate that it does, but that's why it's always best to avoid direct contact with them.
Question about whether different species of bats roost together.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's possible that they can, particularly in bat boxes. You'll sometimes see species roosting together. In caves during the winter, you might see some species roosting together in sort of like an aggregation because it's easier for them to thermoregulate. Bat species that roost in foliage typically don't roost together. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that they do roost together, but they sometimes will roost within the same species together.
Cool. Question about the app or software that's used to convert recorded bat calls to the frequency graph.
Yeah, so there are a bunch of different possibilities for apps that you would use. The one that I was using in those pictures was one that's actually now they've updated the software and moved it to a different platform, but it was called Analook, like ANALOOK. Now they have a new program called Sonobat. There's a program called Kaleidoscope that you can use to view and identify species. It's an algorithm that looks at the call, figures out what the call is most likely to be, and then will assign a species to it. So it depends on what kind of software and programs and devices you're using. There's the one that's probably most like publicly and readily available, and what folks have as members of the public generally, is one called it's put out by the company Wildlife Acoustics, and it's a small plugin that will plug into like a phone, like a Motorola phone or an Android phone, and you can read the calls live. So if a bat flies by, the microphone will pick it up and it'll show you what it looks like, and it can to some degree identify the bat species as well. So it really just depends on what kind of device you're using, which company it is.
Thanks, Kyle. There's a question about whether SAHC considers bat populations as we evaluate potential tracks for conservation, and the answer to that is yes. It's something we do look at, and we do that in a couple of different ways. One, by working with partners that evaluate the properties for that, and then also by working with Kyle. Now that he's joined our staff, we have kind of a more sophisticated capacity to assess properties for their potential to support bats. And so it's definitely something we're looking at and working on a couple of transactions that I think would help benefit that. There's still a number of questions for us to take a look at. One is that somebody has bats living under the eave of their house in spring and summer, and they'd like to evict them themselves, I guess, and wondering how to do that. Yeah,
you should definitely reach out to pretty much any wildlife, like a pest management company would be able to do it. I think that the Wildlife Commission has maybe some information on their website about folks that you could contact, but pretty much any pest management company should have someone who is trained and can safely evict those bats. Like I said during my talk, they'll basically have someone come in, they'll look at the space and evaluate it, and then plug up basically all of the holes that the bats could come in. And now, especially as we're sort of transitioning to winter and bats aren't as likely to be in there, it's kind of a good time for you to contact those folks, because they can do it, especially now that there probably are fewer bats in there, given that it's getting towards the end of the fall.
Cool. We're getting near the end of our time together, and so wanted to share a question that Heather asked, which is maybe one of your favorite experiences working with bats, and kind of how your interest in them evolved, and why you've chosen to focus on them in your conservation work.
Yeah, that's a great question. My favorite species, hands down, is the yellow bat, northern yellow bat specifically. They're not one that we have in the mountains in North Carolina, but there are a couple records of individuals on the coast. although they're predominantly more on the coast of South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and then into the Gulf Coast and down into Mexico as well. And so they're one of my favorite species, and that's the one that I like to work with the most, but don't get to as often because they're not in the mountains. That's, like as I've sort of moved through my different experiences, the more recent things that I've gotten to experience that I hadn't before, because most of my work was on the coast, is doing Hibernacula surveys. Those are really cool and interesting, and you get to go to some cool places and see some bats that are, deep underground and not many people get to see. So I appreciate the ability to do that.
Wonderful. Maybe we can take a couple more of the questions we have. And one of those is about the relation between climate change and the ability of bats to hibernate.
Yeah, that's a great question because it's a really complicated topic. So if we think about climate change as sort of shifting warmer temperatures up during the winter, it's going to be a little bit warmer in some places than it typically was. And so that's one way in which bats could potentially respond positively to some of the effects of it. However, some of the main issues of climate change are damage to ecosystems. So if we have decreasing insect populations, that causes a problem for bats. Bats being potentially impacted by more diseases as climate change continues to happen, it's likely that disease spread will be more prevalent as well. And it can impact the ability of disease transmission to become quicker and more widespread. That could potentially cause other issues for bat species, particularly if we think about diseases that may be more in the tropics right now and bats might be more used to and able to fight off. But if those diseases start to move north, the bats here might not be as well able to deal with those problems. Also, potentially the issue of cave and hibernacula sites. If there's warmer air outside that's intruding more into the cave because it's warmer during the winter, it may reduce the bat's ability to be able to hibernate as effectively. And those are all potential issues that climate change could cause.
Well, thank you so much, Kyle, for this presentation and for your work with SAHC. And want to thank everybody who's participated in the webinar today, and invite everybody to come to future webinars that we have in November. After the Thanksgiving break, we'll have another Lunch and Learn webinar. And if you want to see the schedule for that, we haven't settled on the date yet, but go to appalachian.org and sign up for our newsletter, and you'll get informed about that webinar and other kind of information about SAHC before in time for you to be able to sign up for it. So again, thanks everybody for participating today. We appreciate you and your interest in conservation and our work, and look forward to seeing you in the future. Thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone. I really appreciate it.